I want to move us into why we've used this word empower. You know, our tagline has been, we want to change the course of myeloma, and that's why these next few minutes I want to talk to you about this concept. And this is one of the reasons why, of course, we're doing it in a church. It's one of the reasons why we're doing it on Juneteenth weekend. I was very deliberate, and again, I know some of you are involved with some different Juneteenth activities later today and tomorrow, so we appreciate that you're with us today. But empower stands for myeloma power. It's a bit of a play on words. It's the word empower, E-M, but it's also empower standing for myeloma power. And the concept here is to improve both the short and the long-term outcomes of African American patients with myeloma. I shared with you earlier that if you are here today of African American descent, sadly you have twice the risk of myeloma, and sadly you have twice the mortality with myeloma, or expected survival half that of an individual who is white of your same age and gender. And we want to change that. We want to change that in the short term, we want to change that in the long term. And as we've commented today, some of these issues go back hundreds of years. And so there are some things that we can't immediately change, but if we don't take a vision to want to change it, it will never change. And so as we look at the drivers of this disparity in general, but also specifically in myeloma, that is really the essence of what we're trying to do with this Empower program, to really change the course of myeloma. And if I had to summarize all of Empower in 3 words, these are the 3 words I would use: to engage, to educate, and to enhance. What do I mean by that? To engage is to engage the community, which hopefully we're doing today to some capacity for those who are here and at Grace Baptist and others throughout the whole of the city, where we are engaging people to understand how this adversely affects the community. To know what those signs and symptoms were that we shared earlier, so that if you are experiencing those, that you talk to your doctor about them, so that we can catch myeloma earlier, so that we can find ways to ensure that people have access to therapy. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. The educate part is directed primarily to the primary care providers, those people who are on the front lines that you may see, your doctor or nurse practitioner or someone in the healthcare field at a community center when you have a cold, when you're not feeling well, when you have pain. So that at the very earliest stages, knowing that certain people are at higher risk, even at a younger age. You know, when I went to medical school, we sort of got taught that, we didn't get taught a lot about myeloma, but we got taught about myeloma. It's typically, you know, a disease of people over the age of 70. But in fact, we saw, of course, that people can be much younger, as we've heard today, with myeloma of all races and ethnicities, but in particular in those who are Black. And so we want to educate the primary care providers to know what are the signs and symptoms of myeloma, who's at highest risk, and then not only that, getting into the level of the lab, and I know we have some of our friends here from the lab, is what tests to order to figure it out. You know, the tests that we typically order when you go see your doctor on your annual physical, or just when you're sick, when they test for what I shared earlier, the red, white, and platelet cells, those aren't the regular tests that we look for that bad protein, that monoclonal protein that we talked about, the antibody that is really the disease of multiple myeloma. And so we want to educate them to make sure that they're ordering the right tests. And sometimes certain tests gets missed, and so you don't have this abnormal, so I guess you don't have myeloma, and they go on to something else, when in fact they may have another form of myeloma that requires another test. And we really have sort of 3 really very specific myeloma tests that need to be ordered. So all of our education is not just to raise awareness about, you got to think about myeloma, right? As we often say, if you don't take a temperature, the patient will never have a fever. Right? Like, you need to look for it. And so we have to order the right tests at the right time for that patient. And then thirdly, to enhance. And what do we mean by this? This is really more focused to people who are caring for myeloma. You know, Dr. Usmani just gave us this rapid fire, beautiful overview of how we treat myeloma, how we divide people, and are they transplant eligible or not? Can we give them these newer therapies or not? And we want those people caring for our patients to understand the context in which people come. That every patient is different, every patient is unique, of course, but that we understand that someone's, as we showed earlier, that race matters in the care of that patient. And we want to provide to them the best care possible that is optimal for their own health. We talk about disparities, not to get too technical on us, but when we talk about overcoming disparities, it's not just to bring someone to some baseline level, it's to bring people to their optimal health. That's what we want for everyone. We want the best for our patients. And so we are working very hard to make that happen. I'll show you a few pictures. So we think of Empower, I think of it as a national movement. We're trying to do this in general, wherever we are, and almost, if I could say, it's an international movement. Let's put the I in IMF. It's the International Myeloma Foundation, where we have this same objective and goal. If we had time today, I could tell you about the great work that's actually being done in Africa with our Beyond Medicine's Barriers program, and what we're trying to do to enhance access in countries like Ghana and Ethiopia and many others. But thinking of it here domestically for the short term, we want this as both a national movement, but also a local by local movement, recognizing that no community is the same. Our Sentinel city was in Charlotte. That's where we really kicked off this program. But we've moved to Baltimore, to Atlanta, now in New York, where, as I'll show you in a moment, we're now establishing our presence for the fall, and we're going to be doing programs like this and doing a whole program in Detroit and in Tampa as well. Because these places we know are unique and different, have some commonality to them, and we're slowly working city by city. Now I'm getting calls from other cities and doctors who work in these other cities. When are you coming to our city? So we'll get there. But part of the intention was not to just drop in, do something really quick, and take off and pretend that we've made a difference. It's about staying. And it's about continuing that presence and having an ongoing effect over time. And so as we've come to meet with these communities, we've tried to do it in different ways. Sometimes we've done it through a church-like conference. For those of you who are hip-hop artists, you may recognize some of the people on this slide. I'm not the hip-hop artist, just so you're clear, right? That's actually Dougie Fresh. That's not me. But for me to be, on the stage as it were, Dougie Fresh, like instantly raised my cool factor with my daughters. All of a sudden they're like, whoa, Dad, forget about this myeloma gig. You're hanging out with Dougie Fresh. Like all of a sudden I got cool, right? But we've tried to look at it in different ways and partnered, as I mentioned, with just about everybody to be able to do so. For example, here, myeloma is the 5th cancer. We partnered with the University of Maryland in Baltimore. And they had a big program, an outreach to the African American and Hispanic communities around their location, what they called the Big Four. And so they talked about these 4 cancers, breast, colon, lung, and prostate cancers. And we said, well, can we change that to the Big 5? And we added myeloma to that list, where now they're going and providing door hangers and various things and outreach to raise awareness about how these different cancers affect different populations. We commented earlier about the Myeloma Made Simple video. We've produced all sorts of documents, if you go to the website at myeloma.org, at empower.myeloma.org, you can hear Yellick share his story. You can hear another video from Amy, who you heard earlier, and many, many others to do that. We try and do Facebook Lives and various activities to try and raise awareness within the community. That's the engage part. The educate part, as I mentioned, was speaking to primary care physicians and other providers, and we've had all sorts of programs. Some of them have been certified. We have this little booklet that we've been sending out, so they not only know what are the signs and symptoms to look for, but what are the right tests to order, as I commented earlier, because if you don't order the right tests, you're not going to find the myeloma. And so we've created a program called Don't Miss Myeloma, or Don't Dismiss Myeloma. I had the privilege of speaking at a few of these larger primary care conferences to raise awareness around this so that people can detect it earlier. We have a presence at the National Medical Association meeting, which I'm going to share in a moment. So that's the educate part. And then what about the enhance part? As I said, we're trying now to direct our efforts even to those that care for myeloma. And I'm very excited to share with you a little bit of what we're doing in this program called the Medical Student Scholars for Health Equity in Myeloma. And we've done this in collaboration with the National Medical Association and their research arm, the Cobb Institute, where we put out an application hoping that some students would apply. We had almost 60 students apply for only 12 spots. So these are minority medical students. Many of them come from historical Black colleges and universities. And we've paired them virtually with a myeloma expert over the last 6 months, and they've been working on a project in health disparities in myeloma. anything they wanted to cover, as long as it's to do with health disparities and myeloma. And we're all coming together at the end of July at the National Medical Association annual meeting, and each of the students are going to present posters summarizing their project, and we're going to have a reception to discuss them all and to build a community of individuals that are committed to health equity in myeloma. Now, whether these medical students become myeloma doctors, of course, I'm shamelessly trying to recruit them to become myeloma doctors, but no matter what they do, even if they become cardiologists or primary care providers, I want them to know about myeloma so that they can better the care of those individuals. And we have 12 students paired, as I mentioned, with 12 myeloma doctors. Just giving one example here of one of the students and one of the myeloma specialists connected together. We've also learned in our medical world it's important to publish, get the word out there so that other physicians and providers who we may not directly interact with. And so we've been writing articles and doing projects. I had the privilege of leading this project where we looked at this quality improvement initiative, where we looked at what were the perceptions of patients into how engaged they were. And sadly, we found that Black patients felt less engaged in decision making about their myeloma treatments. And it reminded us of how important it is that we engage our patients in the conversation. We've written about health disparities, and we even did a review for primary care physicians. And so, as I've mentioned, we are here today, and we're excited to be here at Grace Baptist, but coming soon to a theater near you. Well, not quite the theater, but we are coming to Detroit and to Tampa this fall, where we'll continue our efforts in these different places. Although, as I mentioned, of course, very excited to be here today with the group. And I can't help but say this because it really does take a village. It's an incredible team of individuals that we work with, and it's not just me by any means, but we've already heard from Yelik today. But whether you're here or at Grace Baptist, most of these people are here today. I just want to give a particular shout out and thank you to this whole team that works so meticulously to make this happen. In particular, absolutely. In particular, shout out to Haley Wolf, who most of you have met. I often call people I often call people by their initials. So I used to call Haley HW, but that was just such a long thing to say. Now I just call her HW. So we're thankful for HW and the efforts of everybody in making this happen. And we really believe inherently, and I know that I'm a dreamer. That's the way I'm built, but I actually genuinely believe that we can make a big difference, and we can change the course of myeloma, patient by patient, doctor by doctor, nurse by nurse, social worker by social worker. We can, church by church, community by community, we can make a significant impact in caring for patients with myeloma, so that when we come back to Riverside Church, whatever we do, I don't have to say that the average survival of a Black patient is half that of a white patient, but that all patients are living longer with myeloma, independent of their race and ethnicity. Now, earlier I shared with us that part of the challenge of the disparity, again, if I have to summarize the disparity in myeloma, I narrow it down to both the diagnosis being delayed, but also the access to the right treatments. And you heard today about those first three T's, those triplets or combination therapies that work together. Number two, the transplants that we know can have an impact where people receive that chemotherapy and their stem cells back. And also this new therapy that Dr. Usmani talked a little bit about, this CAR T concept. I mean, when you first hear about it, it sounds like you're watching like a Star Trek movie or something. I know I just dated myself when I said that, but this science fiction movie where I can take cells out of you and train them to recognize your tumor and to multiply them and give them back to you. I mean, it's remarkable. But all this occurs, all the advances occur by virtue of what we sometimes call clinical trials. And when we talk about clinical trials, sometimes it's very off-putting to people because they sort of feel, hey, wait a minute, now you're making me into a guinea pig. I don't know what's going on. You're not telling me if I'm getting a placebo or the real thing. What are these? And historically, in particular within the African American community, there has been tremendous hesitancy based on terrible historical things, whether it's Tuskegee or others that I'm sure we're all familiar with, that has caused a tremendous distrust in the system. And we want to call a spade a spade. And that has been a very terrible mark on the history of medicine in this country and in other countries. On the other hand, we know, of course, that clinical trials can have a tremendous positive impact. I can tell you about many patients in my practice who I know are alive today. In fact, I had a dear patient just sent me a beautiful note who said, I want to remind you, Dr. Joe, that it is now my 10th year anniversary of starting one of the clinical trials that I started 10 years ago. He was one of the very first patients on this very new treatment. And he says, and I'm here today because of that trial. And so we want to balance that. We never want to, be a practitioner that comes and says, you'll do it and you'll like it, like no matter what treatment it is, but especially when it comes to clinical trials. So we want to balance understanding the history and the mistrust of the past, but also the present reality of the benefit of trials. So I'm going to ask Dr. Usmani to come up and join me here for a couple of minutes and just do a little bit of a conversation around this, just another 5 or 7 minutes on this notion of clinical trials. And I've selected Dr. Usmani not because he looks so much younger than I do. Yeah, that's coming out again. It's okay. I'll cry later when I'm back in my hotel room in the fetal position. But also because Saad really is a world expert in myeloma and has led some of the most influential clinical trials in myeloma. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to take a couple minutes to talk about it. Then I get to introduce another couple of individuals, wonderful individuals, who I'll do sort of an Oprah-style interview with, and then there'll be lots of time for questions there afterwards. But Saad, let me ask you first, what is a clinical trial? Let's just start with the super basics, right? Like what does it mean when someone says they're sitting in a room like this and they hear, whether it was Amy who mentioned it earlier, you mentioned it, I mentioned it, even Yelek made reference to it. What is a clinical trial? Let's demystify the concept a little bit.
So in a very simplistic way, a clinical trial is a mechanism to move the field forward for our patients and develop new therapies and approaches. When we talk about clinical trials, it's a broad category, but whenever we get a new drug and it has shown promise in laboratory studies, looking at myeloma cells in the petri dish, and it looks like it's promising, or in mouse models, the next step is to see if it will be safe and effective for our patients. So that's that's what we call phase 1 clinical trials, where we get some of those new treatments available to our patients who are otherwise running short of options that are available to them with commercial therapies. Once we prove that point that it's safe, the next step is to see its activity. And that's where the phase 2 trials come in. So phase 2 is once you've established a dose and safety of therapies, you look at that same dose of treatment, give it to a higher number of patients. And at that point, if it's looking promising, especially compared to historic data, you say, all right, now I'm going to challenge what we're doing today to our patients and compare it to this new treatment. And that's what the phase 3 clinical trial is. So unlike popular belief, myeloma clinical trials, typically are not someone getting, or in fact, some, patients getting nothing versus something. Those kind of clinical trials, for the most part, do not, exist in cancer medicine anymore, because we have had a lot of advances in most of the cancers. In fact, almost all the cancers have good standard of care treatments that have improved outcomes. So, one thing that I keep on telling patients is, regardless of what phase of clinical trial is being offered, you are going to be getting treatment, that will likely work for you. If it's a phase 3 trial, you will get at least what you're supposed to be getting as standard of care on those trials, with the advantage that you might get additional benefit from something else being added in the experimental arm.
Yeah, so it's really helpful, because I think it also reminds us that's why it takes so long, right? People watch the news and they hear, oh, we've got a new exciting cancer therapy. We hope to be able to use it in 5 years from now. And people are like, are you kidding me? Why does it take 5 years? And it's because it goes through all of that. But as a patient sitting in the clinic with you, so if one of our patients here were to go to your clinic at Memorial Sloan Kettering or to my clinic down in Arizona or wherever people are, and you sit down with them and you say, well, I have this idea for a clinical trial. You know, is it that the patient just has to say, yeah, okay, just do whatever you want, and I have no say in it, and you know, I want to talk about just for a minute this concept of informed consent, that people really should know what's going to happen, know what the potential benefits are, know what the risks are, and understand what's going to happen to them. We'll come to the financial bit in just a minute, but talk to me a little bit about how that discussion goes in your clinic.
So, you know, we talk about, you know, what the standard approaches of treatment are for that particular scenario. We also talk about, you know, what the clinical trial options are, along with the pros and cons of you know, whether patients, if it's a randomized study, whether they end up on one arm versus the other. And then one thing that I do impart on patients is, you know, you don't have to, just because if you sign up for a clinical trial today after having understood what the pros and cons are, and later in the course, if you change your mind, you know, you're not signing your life away, right? So I think one thing is important, that, you know, when you take that step in participating in a clinical trial, you do it in an informed fashion, and that's what we're here to do, is to provide that information. But it's not that if you feel differently, you know, in the future, you know, that you cannot withdraw participation from a clinical trial. You know, that can be, you know, a problematic concept to understand, but it is so important. And that's true for any treatment, you know, even the standard of care treatment. Just because you're committed to a certain treatment, just like when we're seeing patients in clinic and patients may be having a certain side effect with treatment, and they say, you know what, doc, can you think about giving me something different, because I don't think I can, you know, take this drug. I'm getting such and such symptoms. We don't keep you on that therapy. You know, we take you off and you know, we try something different. So I think that's very important, that this is a team effort. You know, the most important person, you know, is the patient, and we're trying to help you pick the best options for you.
And I think it's important for me to note here that this is partly what Empower is about, and what we've been trying to do at the IMF, and to push hard and say, okay, well, let's look even into the details of that trial. What is a barrier and what is facilitating people to be on that trial? And I think there's a great sense now, because of the health equity movement in our country, to start looking at this. And when we speak to our corporate partners, you know, who are making these drugs and building them, how important it is that their company has a culture of health equity, that they want to reach everyone with their trials, that clinical trials now should have a diversity officer, frankly, that's looking and saying, what are the barriers? Sometimes the barriers is providing transportation. Sometimes the barriers is that all the materials of the trial are not in the right language or cultural sensitivity that people can see it. If every myeloma paper is a picture of a 73-year-old white guy with myeloma, that may not resonate with people. I'm just being very blunt and honest with us here. And so every one of those steps becomes really important. And we're pushing very hard to make sure that no matter who you are, whatever background or race you have, but in particular in historically underrepresented individuals on clinical trials, that you understand fully what's available, that you have time to have that discussion. I like the way you describe that, Saad, in that it really is a two-way conversation, because one of the huge benefits of trials, as you've mentioned, is that sadly, despite all these great new drugs we have in myeloma, eventually myeloma is really smart and it finds a way to grow through it. And so sometimes the only good choices we have are these brand new therapies that have not yet been fully approved, but are going through that approval process by coming into clinical trials. And it's a privilege for us to be able to say to patients, this is something new. This is an option that we haven't had before. And so many of the drugs that we have now in that ridiculously long list that I shared with you earlier went through their clinical trials. And that patient that I made reference to was on a study that now is a drug that we use routinely in practice. But because he had earlier access to it, we were able to rescue his disease before the time. And so I really think that's important going forward. I'm very excited about, unlike you youngins here, I mean, I've been involved in myeloma research for about 25 years. I can tell you, I have never seen a year more exciting than this year in terms of the number of clinical trials that are being done, the new treatments that are being developed, even the way we diagnose myeloma and the testing that we're doing to advance the field has really, really improved. I'll let you close off with any comments before we wrap this up, boss.
No, absolutely. I want to share a story, and this is like a walk down memory lane. So about a little over 10 years ago, I had decided to move from the Myeloma Institute in Little Rock, Arkansas, to North Carolina to start a new program. And I was at an IMF patient seminar like this in a support group on a Saturday morning, and I had a patient come up to me, and he was being taken care of by one of my colleagues at Duke, an excellent physician by the name of Dr. Christina Gasparetto. But the patient lived closer to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I had moved. And he shared his story that he was diagnosed a little over a year ago. He has gone through induction treatment with 2 different types of induction treatments, went through a stem cell transplant, and then within a few months of stem cell transplant, because he had aggressive disease, the myeloma came back, and he's started on something new, and it's not working. Is there any option for me? What do you suggest? And I told him that, well, I'm about to open this clinical trial with this antibody called daratumumab, and it's, we don't know if it's going to work in your situation, but I can see you in clinic next week, and we can get you started. So this patient was subject number 6 on the serious clinical trial, who went into an MRD negative CR within 2 months of treatment, and really changed the momentum for that drug's development, because all the investigators got excited. Oh, wow, if this high-risk patient can go into a complete response with this, we need to enroll patients on that trial. So that patient benefited from it and remained went on to live for 6+ additional years and benefited from other treatments later on. But the reason why I share this story is how important clinical trials can be, and how a chance meeting can change and be impactful for a given patient. And with that patient's participation in clinical trial, today tens of thousands of myeloma patients around the world benefit, because at that time, we did not have good success with many monoclonal antibodies leading up to that point.
Oh, that's fantastic, Saad. And I love how you put it in context, right? Most importantly, it helped that patient, but then it helped others as well. Because sometimes people think, oh, I go into a trial, sort of as a sacrifice to help others, but we want to do it to help that patient. So thank you very much, Saad. That was fantastic. Really appreciate it. Thank you.